You're listening to Period Story, the podcast where we get behind some of the myths and misconceptions about periods. We chat with women about their period story, their first period, and their journey ever since, and we open up a conversation to help break taboos and stigmas around menstruation. I'm your host, Lanice Brothers. I'm a registered nutritionist, women's health, hormone, and menstrual cycle coach, and the founder of Eat, Love, Move, a nutrition and well-being practice. Welcome to today's guest. On today's episode, we have Esther Zimmer. Esther is an Australian communication strategist, online course creator, and writer living in London. She writes a regular essay series called Truth and Clues, where she shares the truth about her life as a woman in her 40s who's still figuring out her place in the world. She's currently writing her first book, a travel memoir, having recently completed a 12-month cross-continental cycling expedition with her husband. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Lanice. Thank you for having me.
So let's start off by getting into the story of your first period. Can you tell us what happened?
Well, that's an interesting question. Yes, so I was very young. I was around 9. And my period was something I had absolutely no idea about until it actually arrived. So when it did, I had no idea what was happening to my body or why. I knew I wasn't hurt, so it was all very much a mystery to me. What I do really remember, and it was interesting, you asked this, and I had quite a almost emotional reaction because I really remember seeing blood on my knickers. And I don't know why, but I felt ashamed, a little bit scared. I seem to recall what I did was I used toilet paper in my underwear. But of course, blood got on my knickers anyway. And what I have another really, really clear vision of is this pair of white knickers with the little flowers on them. You know, the kind of underwear I guess a child would wear, and they were spotted with blood. I guess that's how my mum figured out I'd started my period. And one day she came into my bedroom with this big packet of pads, well, they seemed big to me, and explained to me how to use them. So that, wow, yes, that was the story of my first period.
You were 9 years old, and you were, what was that, year 5, year 4?
I must have been year 4.
So when this happened to you, who did you talk to apart from your mom? Did you talk to any of your friends?
So I was homeschooled, so I didn't really have a lot of contact with other young girls, so there wasn't really a great deal of people to ask. I had a couple of older friends from our church, but I just remember feeling embarrassed. I didn't want to ask. And I think because they were a bit older, I just didn't feel comfortable doing so.
Why do you think you had this feeling of discomfort and embarrassment?
So I feel like that goes back to my upbringing. So it's an interesting question. I was brought up by a white middle-class family in Australia. My wonderful parents are Christians, and they were possibly quite strict back then, which meant they were less open. And I don't want this to be a criticism because they are wonderful parents. They were then, they are now. But I really felt like anything to do with your body or nakedness, menstruation, sex, and it's all intertwined, was just something that we didn't talk about. And I don't feel it was so much that having my period was a shameful thing. It was more that, period kind of is related to bearing of children, which is related to sex. As I say, it was all very much intertwined. And that, I suppose, culture of secrecy impacted me more than I probably realised. And recently, it's something that I've started to explore. So it's interesting that we're having this conversation today.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the exploration that you're doing at the moment?
So I only really in the last year started to understand about how we have different phases in our menstrual cycle. And it was quite a revelation to me. But I'm 45 years old. I'm 46 in January. And I guess I feel a little bit like this is actually something we should be taught in school. It should be part of the sex education curriculum. And or even separate to that for young women to understand about how they work with their body, listen to their body, and understand the natural rhythms and energy cycles. So I guess because that started me thinking about menstruation, the fact that I'm probably coming into menopause in the next few years, that started me thinking about, well, what are my thoughts and feelings and emotions around my own menstrual cycle, and the fact that I don't have children. I'm actually child-free by choice, so I've never, my period is something, I guess, that it's always been, I'm very grateful to get it, but at the same time, it's something that, I go through every month. But for me, I don't really know how to explain that. It's also the other thing of like, well, I'm going through this inconvenience every month, but I've never ever wanted to have children. So it's been just one of those situations when you have all these underlying feelings and you don't even realize they're there. And then, as I said, something will happen that you'll think, well, why don't I know this? It seems like an extrinsic part of being a woman. And you start to explore that. So as I said, for me, it's starting to explore the menstrual cycles. And then what that does is it makes you start to explore all these other areas as well. And so what's interesting is my mum and I have a really, really close relationship, but I've never talked to her about menstruation or menopause. And it's a conversation that I'm starting to open up to have with her. And it's really, it's interesting that all these years later, we're only having conversations about this now.
And how has your mom's reaction been to opening up this conversation?
I feel like she's been curious as to why I'm asking now, but also, she was a young mum. And I think too, if she was answering your question, she'd probably say I would go back and do things differently. And I think she's very open to it, but it does still feel a little bit of an unusual place to go, but probably more so because I think if she could do things differently, she would go back and do them differently and perhaps be a bit more open about these things. But I mean, I'm a big believer that we're all doing the best we can, and in particular parent, and she did the best she could at the time.
You mentioned that you're learning more about your menstrual cycle, the different phases, and you said that you're child-free by choice. Does knowing more about your menstrual cycle, does that change the way that you view the role of your period and and the menstrual cycle?
Absolutely. And maybe that's why I really felt this feeling of slight loss when I started to learn about this, and felt like, wow, if I'd understood this sooner, as a woman who did make the choice not to have children, I felt like it would have meant more to me. I would have understood that even if I'm not having children, my menstrual cycle still has a very important role to play. And I feel like, again, maybe that's the thing about this upbringing, so much of what I learned and perhaps picked up from other people from listening in on conversations was that menstruation was very much linked to childbirth, but now I understand that actually it's got its own very important role separate to that. It would have also helped me understand myself a lot more too, and how I am at different times of the month.
So you said that it has a very important role to play. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what that means for you, what different roles it has to play for you?
For me, it's very much about understanding how to manage my energy in the best way. So, I always feel, sometimes on the day of my period, I can have quite a bit of energy, but after that, I do really feel that distinct drop. And I didn't understand why in the past. When you learn afterwards, it makes perfect sense. But also, as you're going into after your cycle, as you're going into those first few days where you have that influx of energy and you feel good, I would have, this is what I'm doing now. I tend to plan some of my project work and writing around, and running as well, what I do in my kind of fitness life. I tend to look at my period and map it out and think, right, I'm going to work on these particular things when I know I'm going to be feeling at my best. And then when I know perhaps when I'm in a bit of a lull, I'll continue to work on things, but perhaps some of the things that don't require as much energy or creativity. And I found that's just really an amazing way to work. You're actually, what I think of is working with your body. And I realise that it's not always possible. I come from a corporate background, and some of the work I do now a few days a week is in corporate. But I do feel like even if you couldn't necessarily perhaps put that big presentation off, at least if you went in understanding your own body's rhythms and why you felt low, it would give you that extra insight on what you need to do, perhaps, pep yourself up, that, would help. So just looking after yourself in those times and just being more gentle on yourself.
Why do you think it takes us such a long time to get this understanding? I mean, from my own personal experience, I only really started to understand the importance of the ebbs and flows of my energy and the connection with my cycle maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, and I'm 39. So why do you think that it takes so long? Do you think it's the lack of education in school? Is it the taboos around these topics?
I feel that it's probably a little bit of both. I guess, even if you think about sex education in schools, I don't know what it's like now, but if you think of a whole curriculum that you go through, sex education is one tiny, tiny part of it. And then if you think that you would pull out menstrual education, and personally I think that boys should be present in these classes as well. But if you think about pulling that out separately, that you had a menstrual education class, that would still get very, very small amount of time. So I feel like it's just not considered a priority. So education is part of that in terms of time and costs, but I still feel there is quite a taboo about it. And what I feel happens is, as you reach 30, 35, 40, 45, what I've noticed was every 5 years, things that used to embarrass me, even something that might have embarrassed me 5 or 6 years ago just wouldn't now. So I feel that's also a part of it. And maybe too, there is more talk, I feel, about menopause, the menstruation. So as you start to get closer to that, you also question the stage that you're in. And you know what it's like when you start to get curious, you almost stumble upon information.
So how did you educate yourself? What sort of resources have you been using?
So, it's interesting because when I first learned about periods and menstrual health, the first learning experience was when it arrived. Then my mother gave me this Christian pamphlet, and I could still see the cover, and it was called Your Body is a Temple, and now that would have been 1983. Then I started going to school when I was 14, so up until then I was homeschooled. So I guess there was a few questions with girlfriends, and it was, brought up in sex ed. But there was no internet. So, of course, now, I can't think of one specific resource that I use, and I know that there are books on the subject and something that I would be interested to dive into. But more for me, it's been less about menstrual health, I guess, but my exploration has been more about understanding cycles. And some of that I've learnt from open conversations with friends and just what I've seen other women share in groups. So they might be talking about this themselves and they might have written a blog about it, but I can't think of one specific resource. And it's an interesting question because now you're getting me thinking, I really would like to read those books, and actually I'd like to spend more time looking online at specific resources of people who have, like yourself, an expertise in this area.
I want to go back to the book that your mom gave you, Your Body is a Temple. The religious element I find really interesting because you mentioned that you didn't really talk about sex, and menstruation is associated with sex, and that wasn't really a topic in your household. And having come from a similar background myself where religion was really important, I really relate to what you're saying. How do you think that that's had an impact on the way you view your body and menstruation now